Just kidding. Oh, you just wrote it up. I just don't want to lose that. I'm so worried. I'm like, it's okay. I will be very careful. Yeah. I say it's okay. I don't want to. I think it's okay. Like it's okay with me. I think that it's okay with Dr. Lyons too. I'm always hesitant to say what's okay with her because I can't say it. All right. Thank you. All right. Okay, so we're going to shift gears now to talking about representation. If you have your printed article with you, take it out so that you can use it. I only have this book version, but I'm going to be using PowerPoint anyway. I'm going to show you a little video clip that actually features Stuart Hall talking about his own work. And I want you to hear him talk about his work in his own words, first of all. Generally, Stuart Hall, if you found this difficult, among cultural theorists, he is considered, like, in my opinion, very accessible. There are theorists that are within literary theory studies, which is kind of where cultural studies is coming from, who are like, woo, it's so difficult to get through it. I chose Stuart Hall's work particularly because it is accessible to you, while at the same time, it's still difficult. So let's meet Stuart Hall and then we'll talk. If the volume works.
Just let me say what the main theme is, what I'm going to say today is. We're going to talk about the notion of representation, which is a very common concept in cultural studies and in media studies kinds of work. But I want to explore the idea a little bit, and I want to try and say something about how I understand representation working, and why it's a more difficult and more complex subject than it appears to begin with. I'm talking about largely visual representation, or the examples I'm going to try to cite are from visual representation, but I think what I'm going to say has a bearing on the practices of representation in general. I choose visual representation because it's a kind of cliche to say that in the modern world our culture is saturated by the image in a variety of different forms. The image itself, whether moving or still, and whether transmitted by a variety of different media, seems to have become the privileged sign of late modern culture. And late modern culture is not only that culture which one finds in the advanced post-industrial societies of the Western world, but because of the global explosion in communication systems, it is also the saturating medium, the saturating idiom of communication worldwide. So I think to try and take the idea of representation to the image is an important question. And cultural studies has paid a tremendous amount of attention in one way or another to the centrality of representations and the practice of representation, and media studies itself is, in an obvious sense, concerned in part with the variety of different texts, in my instance, visual texts, representations, which are transmitted by the media. But I'm going to stand back from that a bit to begin with and try and look at the process of representation itself. Now, the word has a kind of double meaning, even in its common sense, understanding. It does mean to present, to image, to depict, to offer a depiction of something else. And the word representation or representation does sort of carry with it the notion that something was there already and through the media has been represented. Nevertheless, this notion that somehow representation represents a meaning which is already there is a very common idea, and on the other hand, one of the ideas that I'm going to try to subvert. So I give you the common sense meaning to try to take it back a little bit in what I'm going to say. But then there's another understanding of the word representation which also plays a role in what we bring to this topic, because we speak of political figures as representing us in some way. We don't probably say that very often these days because we may not think they represent us very well, but they're sort of supposed to represent us, and in that sense, they stand in for us. They are our representatives. Where we can't be, they can be. So the notion of something which images and depicts, and that which stands in for something else, both of those ideas are kind of brought together in the notion of representation. Now, what this idea that media practices, among other things, represent topics, represent types of people, represent events, represent situations. What we're talking about is the fact that in the notion of representation is the idea of giving meaning. So the representation is the way in which meaning is somehow given to the things which are depicted through the images or whatever it is on screens or the words on a page which stand for what we're talking about. And if you think that the meaning that it is giving is very different from, or a kind of distortion of what it really means, then your work on representation would be in measuring that gap between what one might think of as the true meaning of an event or an object and how it is presented in the media. And there's a lot of very good work which is in media studies, which is exactly like this.
All right. So, 1 second here. All right. Seeing Stuart Hall explaining some of the basics of his own idea. Does that help a little? I know it was kind of a grainy video, but what images did you recognize in the background playing behind Stuart Hall? Anything? Anything recognizable there? Michael Jackson? Okay, Michael Jackson, anything else? It was blurry, so we can't really see most of it, but some of it, it was so well known to you that even the blurry Michael Jackson face you were able to recognize.
Dawn, I saw O.J. Simpson.
O.J. Simpson, Bill Clinton, anything else? Some of those politicians in the news, you obviously could tell that it was the news behind them. Okay, so the point that he's making here is that he is giving us a common sense kind of like, it's okay to have a very basic definition of representation. And he brings our attention to the word giving away its own meaning, to represent, represent, right? But then he makes a distinction at the end, this is really important, between the true meaning, or, and then that's subjective, meaning people have different ideas of what the true meaning is or should be of something, and the media representation of what that meaning is supposed to be. Okay, so I'm going to open up my presentation here. Just go to those slides and we'll see. Okay, some of these core concepts. I have the worksheet here. I've answered the worksheet in the PowerPoint, but I want to hear from you. What did you put for your definition that you were able to glean from the Stuart Hall chapter? What is representation? How did you find a way to put a little definition for what is such a big chapter?
I wrote production of meaning through language and to describe, to depict an object using our senses.
Okay, anyone want to add to that? Anyone have something a little different? Yes.
It is how meaning is produced and exchanged in our brain and culture.
Okay, any other phrases? So you all had one of these too? In exact words? All right. So I couldn't just choose one, or I wanted to kind of describe the scope of what representation might be. However, There are some that are going to be like the ones that you picked out where you just saw it clearly defined. But Stuart Hall mentions representation and almost mentions definitively representation multiple times throughout those first 16 pages of the chapter. So we have a definition here that could be the process of constructing meaning. Because representation refers to a process. When we talk about representation, we are also thinking about how representation is happening. So the how is part of that process. And then here's more of kind of a more traditional definition here. Using language to say something meaningful about the world, meaningfully to others. So all of this meaning there. And if you're thinking about those approaches that come later, this is where we're getting hints of that constructionist approach that Stuart Hall favors over the other two approaches. An essential process by which meaning is produced and exchanged between members of a culture. Okay, so now representation is a use of language. Now it's an essential process. A communications process, but also an exchange of meaning process. So these are really general, but they encompass a lot, and they're also very complex because of that. And then we have the production of meaning of concepts in our minds through language. So we have representations of things that we keep in our minds. It's very much an intellectual process. This is how it's produced. And we have the connection between concepts and language that allows for references between what we will call the conceptual and the real. Okay, these are loaded terms as well. Like, what is the real? What is the real? Anyone want to elaborate on that when I say the conceptual and the real? The real world. What's the real world? We have no clue. There is no real world. Like, what do you think? What's the real world? Yeah.
Just like tangible things.
Okay, like
Instead
what?
of like a desk or something instead of like love or friendship. That's like not part of the real world.
Okay, good. Who wants to add to that? Who raised their hand over here?
Like things that are already out there, like that already have meanings, or like it's like everybody can agree to, maybe.
Okay, so, and this is one of the things that's difficult about this chapter is that the real world, is the real world the desk? The object itself? Right, but we can't interact with the object without having a concept for it. Is this a desk? Like, is this innately a desk and this is only a desk? This is what this chapter is getting you to think like. It's the question, kind of this old construction of language as reality. Like, we see our language as reality. Is this called a desk in another culture? Is this desk wherever we go throughout the world, this is desk? It is the word desk. No. Okay, so this is an object. We call it a desk. So we have the conceptual is that the thing we call it. It's the symbol, it's the word, it's the sign, it's what we give to this thing that becomes meaningful when we give it meaning. Otherwise, it stays arbitrary, it's an object. Again, it's the limitations of language. It's not even an object. It's something that can't be articulated. It's a thing in the world. We only know it through language. Okay. So, representation involves the use of language, signs, and images which stand for or represent things. This is where it's a little more easy to understand. Like, you get that one thing can represent another. If, with the example that Stuart Hall gave of the politicians, do politicians represent you? Do they? Maybe you say some do and some don't. Maybe you're not, no politician represents me. Maybe you're like, yes, our politicians represent us. That's what their function is. Tell me, what do you think? Don't make me think pair share you. Okay, just like, what do you think? Yeah.
I think they do represent a group of people as a whole. They're the spokesperson, the leader for a group of people, even if you don't always agree with everything they say.
Okay, so when we think of the representatives, what in the United States, like as a job or position, what do we think of? Senators, okay, then they have a legal tie, they have power. What else do we assume about people who represent other people? Yeah.
They represent the majority of that people.
Okay. Okay, and so when we talk about representation, say we're thinking about the Bechdel test again, and we're thinking about women being represented in film. Okay, so we're using this idea of representation within a film context. can we say that there is a representative woman that represents women? No, because that would be like too far. But there are some people who might say, well, I'm representing the LGBT community today. Like, this is not an uncommon thing for people to say who are in the LGBTQ, etc. community. It means to stand in that context. Like, I have a voice right now, and so I'm representing a community. But that could be questioned, right? There could be like, you don't represent me or whatever. I don't identify with what you're saying. That's not me. So it's really tricky and it's really complicated. So to represent, as a verb, I'm giving us, from the chapter, we have a couple of definitions here. 1, to describe, depict, or call to mind in portrayal, imagination, or description. So that's a lot, okay? This could be something represents something else. It makes you think of something else. Okay, to you, it represents something else. It could be to elicit a likeness or bring something, like a person, place, or thing, to mind. Okay, so something reminds you of something else. Like, oh, you remind me of my grandmother. So that person, or whatever it is, represents something else to you. Common terms that we use, but looking at it in a little bit more of a deep way. And then thinking about it in a media studies, gender studies context. These are examples. Okay, so I'm going to go to this one first at the bottom, actually. The image of the balance. There's the image right there. Okay, an image where you see this little logo of a balance. Usually it represents justice, right? If you saw this little icon, do you think everyone in this room would kind of associate it with justice?
Not me.
Not you? What do you associate it with?
It's Libra.
Libra, okay, me too. Astrology, okay? So, some people who are Libras, or who have, like, dated a Libra, or who know a Libra, or whatever, they would be like, oh, that's an astrological sign. That's what I would think of first, right? So it represents astrology to you, but to many it might represent the justice system. And what does that mean when we say it represents the justice system? That could mean, I think, bad thoughts. The justice system is messed up and it's not right. Or it could mean it doesn't represent the politicians that I don't like or that are doing bad things. It represents the concept of justice itself. Right, what is right, and the imparting of what is right. Okay, so we're all going to have a different idea just from this, but at the same time there are shared concepts that we have for it. What about the logo, if you saw a logo of a gavel? You guys all know a gavel? Who uses a gavel? What do you think of with a gavel?
Sure.
Does everyone think of that? It represents a judge to everyone. You see the gavel, you're like, judge, court. Anyone else have a different thought if you saw a gavel? I couldn't find I found these little logos of gavels, but I couldn't get them to appear the way that did for some reason, and they also looked like hammers, just like I'm working on building something, so I was like, I don't know, that's a different symbol. But any other interpretations of the gavel?
Yeah, they use them in a whack-a-mole game at an arcade.
Okay, the little heads pop up and you just hit them. Okay, so not exactly a shared meaning, but very much a shared meaning in a way. Okay, so say we have, because this is in these instances with the gavel and the scales. The image of the scales or the balance represents a concept. Okay, it's not necessarily going to mean literally that if you see this as a logo, say you're a law firm and you're like, this is our logo, Mason's Law Firm, whatever. Okay, then that doesn't necessarily mean I'm advertising scales. We sell scales. That's what we do. We sell the scales. No. It means we're practicing something. And this is a representation of what we value, which is justice. However, there's another way of thinking about it, and that's in the example of the portrait of Joan of Arc burning at the stake. Okay, Joan of Arc, in this instance, we've got a portrait of Joan of Arc. So we don't actually have Joan of Arc. Okay, say we had a portrait of her right now today. Joan of Arc's not here. She's not actually burning at the stake in the moment. We have a representation of an event. Okay, because Joan of Arc was burned to death. She was burned to death at the stake. So the event is not exactly the same as the idea, but both are being represented. I actually have a couple of images here of Joan of Arc so that we can kind of see how this plays out. Because in film, this is a layered image, because this is an image depicting an image from a film. It's an image of an image. Because they took the image of the woman who played Joan of Arc in this rendition of Joan of Arc, which was a silent film, and they painted it. So it's an artistic rendering of a photograph taken of a film. So when we think about representation in this instance, it's a representation of a representation of a representation of a representation of an event, which was Joan of Arc burning at the stake. But this is a very popular image. Films have been made about it. Plays have been written about it. Shakespeare has a character, Jean La Pucelle. So when we're thinking about the representation, it's not just in images, it's also in language. It's in stories being told. They're all part of that various kinds of representation. Are there commonalities between these images of Joan? What are they?
There's a woman being burned to death.
What?
There's a woman being burned to death.
Okay, there's a woman. Well, how do we know that's a woman? What signals us to say it's a woman?
Dress.
Okay, breaking down our criteria a little. The dress, because how do we know that that's a woman? Joan of Arc, if you historically know anything about Joan of Arc wore men's clothes. Joan of Arc pretended to, kind of assumed a male identity in order to fight for France, okay? And also believed that she had been visited by spirits that told her that France would win the war, and she tried to convince people of this, and the Catholic Church killed her. Okay, so this is sort of like a really bad version of Joan of Arc. So I just want you to break down all these criteria of what this represents to you. If you just saw this image right here, you don't know it's Joan of Arc, right? You just see it in isolation. What do you think's happening here? What's happening to this person? Yeah.
A public execution.
A public execution. Okay, how do we know that?
Well, in the background, I believe that's people, and then in the foreground, you see her like with her arms crossed, like around each other, and like usually when someone's like wrapped up like that, they're like public execution.
Okay. Any other thoughts about this? Of what you would think? Everyone here would think public execution.
I think like Salem witch trials, just because they got burned at the stake a lot.
Okay, so the representation of Joan is mirrored in the representations that we have of Salem witches being burned. Okay, good. Mark.
Could be a representation of like rebellion, like protest.
Yeah, and why do you say that? What criteria are you using in reading the image?
Because protesters go to the extreme and they get tied us up to a pole to like move it or something crazy like that.
Yeah, and even if you're reading her facial expression, what is the face of Joan like there?
Mundane.
Mundane. Any other interpretations? Yeah?
Defiance.
Defiant. Why do you say defiant? What's defiant about it?
Like, I think in all the pictures, like, she's, like, looking up. And so, like, she's, like, looking, like, she's not looking at anyone in the face, kind of thing.
Key. Bingo. This is it. When you're thinking about representation and you're going to study films and you're going to study images and you're going to study different kinds of mediums and you want to take a theme and you want to look at it, you want to take apart these little things, but then you want to look across and see. Because that is a great observation that in every single one of these, Joan is looking up. What is it about representation of Joan? Why do we have Joan always looking up?
Because a lot of people look down when they feel shame, and clearly she wasn't feeling shame about what her actions were doing. So she's kind of like proud to be in this position in a way. Like, it's unfortunate, but she wouldn't have done it any differently, I would assume.
Okay, so the event of Joan burning at the stake. Do we think that Joan, when she was burning at the stake, was looking up? Do you think based on these depictions, collectively, that people who study Joan or know of Joan think of her as looking up?
I think she didn't have to be, but it was more like people's depictions, like, representing a certain, like, mentality or, like, movement in this case. So, like, if people want to believe that she was defiant when she was burned at the stake, like, that's, like, how they depict it.
That's great, because representation is not just about what happened. It's sometimes about what we want to believe happened. Okay, and then these are distinctions that you want to be thinking about. Very good. Okay, that's a good little initial into it. Okay, so another concept here, we have systems. Back on, if I just need one. Okay, systems of representation. So these are going to refer to concepts and signs. Concepts are the ideas that we have, right? Concepts for things. So desk, concept. And signs, the words that we have for them. So we might have a mental image and a concept that is a combination of a sign, a word, and a mental image. And then that kind of becomes our concept. Then I've underlined this one because this is a little bit more of the definition that Stuart Hall is giving us. The systematic process through which objects, people, and events are correlated with a set of concepts or mental representations that we carry around in our heads. Okay, so we have these systems of representation, and it's like the way that we give meaning and how meaning works all together. And then the construction of a set of correspondences between people, objects, events, and ideas. This is kind of, it starts to go over our heads, right? We start to read them, we're like, But really just think about it this. We know what representation is, at least on some level, okay? We have some idea of what representation is, and then it's a system of that. It's a system of that. It's a system of the way that things in life are represented, okay? I also have some additional details. See, it gets really complicated. So I do want to go over this with you, but take what you want from it and what you find meaningful and what you understand. Systems of representation will consist of different ways of organizing, clustering, arranging, and classifying objects. So it's really complicated. So we're just talking about a desk right now, but we have whole systems of language, right? And across cultures, there's various different kinds of systems of language. And then the use of language is different depending on the context. So even if we're all using English, when we go into a courtroom, the use of the English language gets to be very different than the way that we're using it in a classroom, which is very different than the way that you're using it at home, with your parents, with your friends, with your whoever, people that matter to you. The means through which we establish complex relations between others, this is how we do it. We do it through the system of representation. So these are some examples, okay? It might be concepts for what we perceive, so that's like objects in the world, and the concepts that we have. So have you ever had a name for something that is not what other people were calling it? That might be like, with my kids. We have certain names for things. Like you name your pet, okay? A dog might come in here and everyone might be like, dog, dog. But you might have a certain word for dog that you use, right? You just have like, my girls call their dogs doggo. They're like, oh, doggo. Okay, so they have their own system of language for that. Yeah, what were you saying?
It's like clicker or remote. People say it differently.
Exactly.
What they use at home.
Any others examples that were popping in your head?
I refer to it as soda, but I found that when I came to Buffalo, a lot of people call it pop.
Pop.
I actually had no idea what that was.
Right, and I combined them because I moved to the Midwest for a while, and then I call it soda pop, which is probably like the worst version, but I like to be inclusive, okay?
Yeah, I was gonna bring that one up actually, that there's like regional differences, like.
Exactly.
I worked at Wegmans, and we called, like, you know, the sub oil, we called it sub sauce.
The oil that you put on the subs.
They call it oil.
Sub sauce.
Yeah, because I
Okay.
asked for sub sauce, and they looked at me
Like
and
gravy and dressing. There's
Wait,
another
what?
distinction between that. Yes.
Well, I have like 3 little brothers, so like they give a certain name just because they're little. They give everything a different like word.
Yes.
And then when I like come here, I'm like, oh yeah, like can I have some fruit snackies or like bandage. Or people are like, what's a bandage? Like oh, a Band-Aid, and they're like, why would you like? But it's just like for the past 8 years I've
Exactly.
been calling fruit snacks.
You've developed a common language of your own with your family or your friends. Like I will say, do you have an owie? To my kids when they hurt themselves. So I like if you hurt yourself, it's possible that I can be like, oh, you have an owie. Like I don't know. Yeah.
I work with a severely autistic girl whose like mental processing is impaired in addition to her speech, and so she like literally has her own language. In total, like she calls quesadillas tacos.
And have you learned her language?
And I've like had to learn it. And I'll catch myself like going out with friends being like, oh, yeah, let's go get some like tacos, and I really like want a quesadilla, and I'm like, wait, that's not. What I
So
meant.
you've learned someone
They're
else's
like,
language.
Yeah,
That's really neat.
Unreal.
That's good though because it's expanding your own kind of thinking about language itself. Yes.
My family all calls like any like over medium or over easy eggs divvy eggs.
What is it?
Divvy eggs
Dibby eggs?
instead of like over medium or over easy.
All right. Yeah, because you dip them because they're soft and you put it in the yolk. Okay.
We call them suckers here, but people are like, what's a sucker?
What is it? Lollipops?
Yeah.
Lollipops. Okay. All right, good. Any others before? This is the fun part, and then we have to go back to all the concepts. Yeah.
When she said, like, I'm not from state, so at home we call sandwiches, not salads.
Oh, but okay. So the sub would be
subs are different here, though.
Yeah.
right. There's a distinction here, but all anything with bread and something in between.
It's a hero.
It's all a sandwich there. Okay.
She just said a good one, tennis shoe and sneakers. Because like a lot of people from like Texas.
All right. Who has tennis shoes here?
Two different things.
Do you have your one? Hey, you're a minority in this room, but stand proud. Okay. All right.
So for like last year when I was a freshman, like me and my friend who was from Long Island, we used to go to C3, and every time there was boneless chicken like tenders. Well, they were like chicken tenders, but she called them boneless wings. I'm like, no, honey, that's not a boneless wing. That's a chicken tender. Like there are two. And she's like, no. I said, I'm from Buffalo. I know what it is. She's like, well, I'm Long Island.
Like we own, here's a representation that Buffalo has, right? We have an image of ourselves as like owning chicken wings. Like we own the wings. And when I don't even eat wings because I'm pescatarian, but even when I go other places, I'd be like, that's a shame. Like that is not a buffalo wing. Like that's a disgrace. Like
If you're like not from Buffalo, people call it like buffalo sauce, but it's just hot sauce.
so the buffalo wing represents us as a people.
Hot
What do you think
sauce.
about it?
It's not specific.
All right, one in the back, yeah.
Another thing, like the game, like we'll say like buffaloes, we'll say people in the middle, but everyone else says monkey in the middle.
What?
Like,
So you want to know, like, I want to know the origin of how, whether the pickle or the monkey came first. Okay. All right. Sorry, we got to get back on track because we're going to run out of time. Okay. So these could be concepts for obscure or abstract things, like our concept of war. When we talk about the concept of war and peace, that's very different than actual specific wars, right? And there are beliefs that we hold about war that might be similar or different, but it's a concept that we have. Like, war is not something we should do. We don't want war. We want peace. We want to get along. These are ideas that we hold in our head. Okay, classifications according to principles, such as sequencing. This might be causality, our ideas of like weather being caused by greater patterns in climate change and that kind of thing. Or the use of principles of similarity and difference to establish relationships between concepts. Okay, so the way that we kind of see one thing as separate from another is by like really emphasizing difference. Or the way that we try to identify two things together is by looking for their similarities. Okay. Oh yeah, like I have this, it's a bird, it's a plane, it's Superman. Anyone? Like we used to play that when we were like kids and be like, my cousin was obsessed with Superman, so you know how can someone say it? How it's said? Well, like with like feeling?
It's a bird, it's a plane.
It's Superman! Okay, so what do we associate with all these things? Is a bird a representation of a plane? Is a plane a representation of a bird? Maybe in some instances in art and things like that, okay, we will have that. But again, these are separate entities, but they fly, and they bear something in common. We keep them connected because of that commonality. So, key points I want you to remember is that meaning depends on relationships between things. People, whether they're real, whether they're fantasy. Language is the system of representation and the process of constructing meaning. And conceptual maps are the way that we classify concepts in our minds. These are not something, we're not necessarily going to make a conceptual map, although we could. And it might be very associative, but these are just like the way that we connect everything in our minds. Okay, so mental representation. This is basically the idea that is held in our heads of a representation. So an idea that is held in which an object, person, or place or thing is represented in a certain way. So when I ask you, Santa Claus, what do you first think of?
Christmas.
You got, no, but what is the image in your head? So this is the mental representation I'm talking about. Now we might all have similar mental representations, or we may have very different mental representations of what Santa is or whatever. I chose elf. I don't know why elf popped in my head, but it did. So when I say elf to you, I've already put these pictures. So I've already I want to go back to what your mental representation of an elf is. Each of you, if I said, without showing you that, I said, well, what do you think of when you think of an elf? You'd have something specific. Now, we might all have common images. We might all have pictured someone that has pointy ears. Maybe we didn't. Maybe you pictured, what's the actor's name, Will Ferrell? Maybe you pictured Elf from the movie Elf, okay, and that's your quintessential elf. Maybe you pictured Elf on the Shelf. Maybe you pictured something. I picked Lord of the Rings. Okay, so maybe you thought of Lord of the Rings, and that was your idea of what an elf was. Maybe you thought of elves at Santa's shop in the mall, or something like that. We all have a mental representation of what things are. Now, we can have many different mental representations of what it is, right? But we also sometimes tend to think of certain things. If I said your mom, or think of your best friend, right? You're going to have a mental representation of your head what that means. That's all that this is. This is pretty intuitive, pretty easy to understand. Now we get into symbols and symbolizing, okay? You've probably, this hopefully takes you back to an English class that you had in high school when you had to talk about one thing and how it was a symbol for another. But this is all over. We've already kind of discussed this with the chicken wing. The chicken wing is a symbol of buffalo. It's a symbol that like symbolizes what? What does it symbolize about buffalo?
That we have really good food.
Okay, that we make good chicken wings, but what else might it represent or symbolize? Communities, because a lot of times when we have our wing fests and we have our sports events, wings are tied very closely to sports. By the way, my brother wrote a children's book about Duffy the Wing. He's very good friends with the owner of Duff's, and so I don't know if people have very strong opinions about wings and where the best wing is, but my brother thinks Duff's has the best wings, and he wrote this book called Duffy the Wing. I don't know why wings came up, but it's good. It's good that wings came up. I don't know. Okay, so a symbol. We have a sign. A sign is a form of language. Okay, and then we have a symbol. A symbol is a representation for which meaning has been accepted by a group of people or a community. So it's culturally specific, which means it varies across communities. So I gave the example here of the recycling sign. Do you have a mental image or representation of what I mean when I say the recycling sign? What is it? The 3 green arrows, right? I'm glad I didn't put that up. Did anyone picture something else? Did everyone picture 3 green arrows in a triangle? Okay, so most people might have, unless you've never seen that. What else?
I pictured like a dumpster site with like sectioned off. I don't know
Okay, so you
why.
had a little bit of a different mental representation when I said the recycling sign. Okay, so this is a symbol of recycling that is commonly used throughout the United States, right? Is it across cultures? If you are going to go very far away and you go to, where do you want to go? Where do you want to travel to? You go to the Bahamas. Oh, Bahamas are having a hard time. Okay, where else do you want to travel to?
I went to Ireland over the summer, and their recycle bins aren't green, they're brown.
Okay, different color that we associate with recycling across cultures. Also, the 3 arrows, recycle, they stand for something. They represent something. Those, what is it? Recycle, reduce, reuse. Okay, so even without saying it, you just see the sign. We can remember those we learned in school or whatever. But, so it represents words, and it represents the act of recycling. But it's not cross-cultural. But it's a symbol in our culture.
I think Disney came out with like a song about recycling. I'm not 100%
Probably, I'm sure there's a lot of songs.
2000s.
Okay, symbols do not have universal meanings. This is the whole thing we just kind of talked about. So again, if we look at some of the astrological signs, these are not necessarily universal meanings, although they might be more cross-cultural than others. So if we look up there at the scorpion, okay, and it's a picture of a scorpion. It's supposed to represent Scorpios. What is that? It's supposed to represent an identity of people who are born in a certain period who have certain common features, okay? But if you take it out of context and you don't see Scorpio and you just see a picture of a Scorpio, say you're walking down the boardwalk and you're in Florida or something, and all of a sudden there's like a red sign with a picture of a scorpion on it, you are going to think what?
That one
Like, they're telling you, like, don't go there. This is, like, the scorpion zone, and they're going to come and get you. Like, you might think that because the red color is associated with, like, danger. But you might think something totally different. So these are just all different signs. Again, we have different astrological signs that maybe you don't think about. What about this little picture there? What is that?
A witch's hat.
Does everyone say that's a witch's hat?
Yeah.
So what is that little hat a symbol of?
Magic.
What else?
Supernatural.
Does it share the same? Is it a symbol of the same thing for everyone? Actually, where I found it, they said it was a symbol of, like, evil. And so they were not for the witch thing, they were like against it, but I still use the symbol. But it might symbolize something different for various people. Also, people might really identify with witchcraft, but not find that to be a symbol of what that is to them. What about this? What's this? A little tiny wolf head. Is that a wolf to all of us? Is this inherently a wolf? Like, is this a wolf? Are we looking at a real wolf? Okay, so we're a representation of a wolf, an actual wolf, which has been given a sign, a language, and called wolf, which is not inherently wolf, but we named it wolf, okay? All right. So a sign, and the signify. These are, the sign is something that can be really simple or really complicated. And to signify something is to represent, right? So you could say, you know, okay, the buffalo wing it symbolizes or it signifies this or that within buffalo culture. A sign is going to stand in or represent concepts and conceptual relations between them that we carry in our heads. So together we make up the meaning within systems in our culture. It's organized into language, okay? And it is common languages that allow us to translate our thoughts or our concepts in our head into signs or words or sounds or images, and to use these as a language expressing meaning and communicating thoughts. So in general, as we know now, and we've sort of discovered here, language is broad and inclusive. We have lots of different writing systems. We have spoken systems. We have common ways of, if you're happy, what do you do? What do you do with your body when you're happy? This might not be common for everyone, but I'm asking you, what do you do? Smile. So the smile is our way of communicating, okay? It might not be that way for everyone. Someone might be very happy and they're just like, oh, what about crying? You've cried when you're happy sometimes. It can happen, right? And you might look like, what's wrong? The other night my daughter called crying and she was like, ah! And I don't live with her during the school year, so I'm like, what's going on? What's going on? And she's like, my character on Fairy Tale died or something. And then I contextualized her tears. Then I started laughing because at first her tears were signaling to me like she was in some kind of agony. She really was sad, but I was like, your gerbil died. Like, what happened? And then it was not really that. Her friend who played this, they named other characters from a show called Fairy Tale, it's anime. The character died, then she's laughing and crying. So not all of these things, we can't say they're in compartments. We can't say that tears means, but tears might represent sadness to most of us, but tears could also represent the opposite of sadness. Very, very complicated. I do want to try to get through this, but I don't think we're going to do it. Okay, so signs are going to refer to the meaning that we give things. They're going to carry meaning, and they're also going to have to be interpreted. I'm going to skip right over into our actual, it's a sign. Have you ever had anyone go, it's a sign? What does this mean? Or what can it mean?
Like a message from above telling you to do something.
So a sign could be an omen. When we say it's a sign, it means it is a sign that something is going to happen, or it's a sign. It's a sign that I'm a bad person, or it's a sign of whatever. It's a sign that, like, the world is ending. I just put up this picture. Does anyone know who this is? Okay, oh wait, when I say who is this is a layered question as well. Who is this?
I forget her name. She's from Harry Potter.
A character from Harry Potter. Anyone want to give me the name? Trelawney. Okay, Professor Trelawney. In the scene, this is also Emma Thompson, the actress who plays Professor Trelawney. And in the scene, she's practicing divination class. Okay, she's teaching them to be diviners, like of the future, to be able to have prophetic wisdom. And she looks into the coffee cup and she sees something and she says basically, oh God, you have the grin. This is a symbol of something bad. This is a sign. Bad things are coming to Hogwarts, okay? So in this case, she's using that phrase, it's a sign, in a different way than if we pass this, or another sign, or this up there that says keep gate closed no matter what the chickens say, you're on a farm, and I don't know, I just thought that was a funny sign. So you pass that and you go, oh my God, it's a sign. No, literally, like, it's a sign right there, okay? So we just have all of these layered meanings. So when you're thinking about a sign, you're going to think about, obviously, like the sign that hangs in front of the door, but you're also going to be thinking about a sign that means something. It's referencing back to this idea of meaning that Stuart Hall is really focusing on and telling us what representation is. So the production of meaning determines the relationship between things, concepts, and signs. We are always producing meaning. We are always using, we're engaging in the production of meaning. We're participants in it. And language, this is signs organized into relationships. It's a system, right? So the system of representation is very much like the system of signs that is language. Do you have a question?
Are these on using
I will post this whole slide up, and you can make sure you've got your sheet filled up, because I know that we're not going to get to all of my stuff.
Thank you.
Yeah. Okay, codes. This is where we think about codes. You might think about computer codes, HTML code, whatever else, but we're thinking about codes in a little bit more basic way as kind of like the system that we use to make sense and to organize the signs and the language that we're using. So they govern relationships between signs. They make it possible for us to speak and receive information. And they also establish translatability between concepts that we have, the language that we have that allows us to make more meaning, to keep producing meaning. And this is all going to relate to when films are there, because they offer representations, they also offer productions of meaning. So the thing that Stuart Hall wants us to remember is that signs are arbitrary. Like the fact that we call this a desk, it's not because there's just something so desky about this. Like it could be no other word. This could only be desk. It's just like, why did we ever name this a desk? Why did we call the creature that goes hoo hoo an owl? Why? Now we could try to trace it back and say, okay, some things that we name because of the sounds they make. Like we reproduce those names and we name it. And other things are very arbitrary. So Stuart Hall stresses that signs are arbitrary, but that the meaning that we give signs can become fixed by codes that we have. Now I'm going to skip this. You can look at that on your own. This is important. Fixed meanings. Basically, Stuart Hall says a few things about fixed meanings, and some of them are like, whoa, is this a contradiction? Because I'm going to go to the middle, and it says they don't really exist. Really, in some ways, there are no fixed meanings, but we can accept them as fixed meanings, so they can exist within our language. So you might say, well, the word owl means this creature, and someone's like, no, that's my little, maybe it's something else, okay, right? You can argue about it, but meanings become fixed because we accept them. So sometimes we can have a fixed meaning, and someone might say, well, gender is this, and sex is this, and sexuality is this. And there becomes a fixed meaning, or someone might insist upon it, and then someone else might say, no, gender can mean all of this. Sex can mean all of this, and it's not really a fixed meaning. So it's controversial. So really, Stuart Hall is saying fixed meanings don't really exist, but that they can become accepted as fixed meanings. Does that make sense to you? Okay. It's a little complicated. And what happened here? I don't like that. All right, meanings are not fixed in nature. The examples I give are the words gay, wicked, and ship. Because I learned ship from my daughters, because my daughter calls herself the ship fairy. And I was like, you're the ship fairy, that's so cool. You want to be like a marine, you want to go out into the sea, or like you want to lead a ship. And it means that she wants to be like the matchmaker of her group. Like she wants to, and then she'll say, oh, she ships this person. And I'm like, she ships them? Sending them somewhere? No, it just means like she likes them. So a new language, why did that happen? Why did that come?
It's shortening of relationship.
Thank you. I did not know that.
It's
That is brilliant. Oh my God. I bet my daughter doesn't know that though. She's 11. Maybe she's actually really smart. She probably knows. She'll be loving that I didn't know that, and she'll be like, duh. But she might not know it. Did all of you, let's have a moment of honesty. Did all of you know that ships refer to relationships?
No.
Wait, who said no? Come on, solidarity. Thank you, my people. Okay, all right. But gay can mean many things too. It has different meanings. It has more fixed meanings. It has more accepted meanings that are more popular than others. But gay, way back when, would mean happy. If you listen to old music, it's like, la la la, we're happy and gay. Like, that's like how it is. But what about wicked?
Cool.
Yeah, that's wicked good, all right? Versus like, that's wicked of her. Like, that was truly wicked. Versus, like, I am wicked and I'm powerful. Okay, so lots of different meanings for those.
Wicked, I think of the play, like right off the bat.
Did I have anything else that's cool? Oh my gosh, there's so much I can't go over with you. All right, I'll put it up there. Oh, we were supposed to talk about the bowl. Maybe another day. We talked about chicken wings anyway. No, I'm not collecting it. Go on, UB Learns, get the rest of your information, check it off with mine. If you have any questions, let me know.
Are you gonna collect them next class?
I never collect the worksheet. But wait, your homework. Make sure you read it. Plus, your reading response is due.
Do we type it or handwrite it?
Definitely.
Oh, it
We
says
learned that
type it,
lesson. We're all typing it. Okay. Type the reading response and bring it with you to class on Tuesday and read pages 1 through 40 in Curie. All right. Have a great weekend. Oh, you are? It is a specific thing yeah, go when you can learn, and it will say reading response assignment 1. You gotta follow it. You know what I mean?
That was short. Huh? For what? For what class? Me as
Oh, really?
I just came from.
I quit, so. Yeah. I'm so used to it. Yeah, it's gonna be hard. Are you a senior? Yeah, but I'll be here. Yeah.
Are you thinking about joining the team next year? Or are you joining the team next year?